My name is Alan Price. I am the director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum, and on behalf of all my library and foundation colleagues, I am delighted to welcome all of you who are watching this evening's program online, as well as those of you who are here with us in person tonight. I'd like to acknowledge the generous support of our underwriters of the Kennedy Library Forums, lead sponsors Bank of America and the Lowell Institute, as well as the Mass Cultural Council and our media sponsor, the Boston Globe. I am so pleased to welcome Bill Lowell of the Lowell Institute, who is here with us this evening. For over 30 years, the Lowell Institute has been the lead underwriter of the library's public forums, and we remain indebted to Bill and the Lowell Institute for their longstanding and generous support. Thank you, Bill. If I can ask you to silence your cell phones, that would be marvelous. We look forward to a robust question and answer period this evening. If you are joining us in person, we'll be collecting questions in writing during the conversation this evening, and our team will be passing through the hall to collect your queries. And if you are joining us online, you'll see full instructions on screen for submitting questions via email or comments on our YouTube page during the program. Heather Cox Richardson kindly signed copies of her book before tonight's program, and our bookstore has copies available for sale if you are interested. We're so grateful to have this opportunity to explore key issues for our democracy with our distinguished guests this evening. And I'm now delighted to welcome back to the JFK Library, Heather Cox Richardson, a professor of history at Boston College. She has written about the Civil War, Reconstruction, the Gilded Age, and the American West in award-winning books whose subjects stretch from the European settlement of the North American continent to the history of the Republican Party through the Trump administration. Her work has appeared in the Washington Post, the New York Times, The Guardian, among other outlets. She is the co-host of the Vox podcast Now and Then. Her latest book is Democracy Awakening, Notes on the State of America, and it is always so rare and special to see a historian become a rock star. It is also a pleasure to welcome back Tom Nichols to the library. A staff writer at The Atlantic and an author of the Atlantic Daily Newsletter, he is also a professor emeritus of national security affairs at the U.S. Naval War College, where he taught for 25 years, and an instructor at the Harvard Extension School. He served as a legislative aide in the Massachusetts House and the U.S. Senate. He writes about international security, nuclear weapons, Russia, and the challenges to democracy in the United States and around the world, along with occasional contrarian views on popular culture. Please join me in welcoming our special guests.
Hey.
It is such a pleasure to be here. And am I the only one who wants to ask him about Carla?
Carla is my cat.
The cat has a presence on Twitter.
Yes, she's well. She's getting on in years. So congratulations.
Thank you.
Let's just dive in with the book. Why you called it what it's in. I said to you earlier, kind of an optimistic title at a dark time. Why you chose that title? Why you wrote the book?
So, and this is why Tom is a perfect interviewer, because I knew that title would get to you, and that sunrise, there's a sunrise on the cover, and we're going to discuss whether or not that was appropriate for this moment. But to give you an overview of the book and what I was trying to do is it was intended to be a series of short essays that answer the questions that people ask me every day. Why did the party switch sides? What was the Southern strategy? How does the Electoral College work? You know, who wrote the Constitution? Those sorts of questions. But I realized pretty quickly that the question that everybody asked me all the time was, how did we get here? What on earth is going on? And how do we get out? So I wrote 30 chapters, short essays. I think the book is about 250 pages, that took you through those three sections. How did we get here? Where are we? And how do we get out? Answering those questions that people asked. And then I put the manuscript away for about 3 months. And when I picked it up, I discovered it had done something very different when I wasn't looking, quite as students do when you teach them and then you leave them alone for a while. Often when you come back into the classroom, they have created something that you informed, but that they made something new of. And what I discovered was that the book had created its own story, and that was the story of how democracies die, how authoritarians overturn them, how authoritarians take power, and then crucially, how societies can get their democracies back. And the argument that I made in that book was about language, how language and the use of history can destroy democracy and rebuild it. So the book itself became a story of the present, but also with luck, a story of the future. And it is a rising sun on the cover and not a setting sun, because I do believe that democracy in this country has awakened. And now I'm out of here. Because you can just wait to hear what Tom's going to say in response.
No, I mean, it's you and I took two very different roads to end up at the same place about the state of democracy in America. And I want to believe that you're right, and if I didn't think you were right, I probably wouldn't be sitting here, because you'd say, well, what is the point of ever talking about any of this, because all is lost. And I don't believe that either. But it still feels pretty dark. And so the next thing I wanted to ask you, strangely enough, I want to skip, we'll come back to the beginning and the end, but I want to skip right to that second central part of the book about where we are today, about how you would describe it, because I think people are either too complacent in their language, well, we're muddling along, or they are too hyperbolic in their language, that we're living under fascism. If we were living under fascism, you and I wouldn't be on this stage, we'd be in jail. So where do you think we are? And tell us about that kind of central part of the book where you kind of really lay out in incredible detail the many terrible things that have happened over the years. And I think it's really, I found it kind of almost vertigo-inducing to read that part of the book, because you forget how many terrible things have happened. And when you see them all in one place, you think, my God, how are we still here?
That's actually not a flippant point, in that the middle section of the book is, I think, 2015 to at least 2021, maybe 2022.
Certainly through January 6th.
Through January 6th, for sure, or 2021 for sure. And it's interesting because when I wrote that section, the point about detail is interesting because as I say, these were intended to be short essays. And when I wrote that middle section, which of course covers the Trump administration, I felt when I first wrote it, in the first draft, that I had to keep the record, because nobody knows that administration better than I do. Every single day, I was following everything. So the first time I wrote a draft of the chapter on Russia, and in my mind, the chapters were to be about 3 1/4 single-spaced pages on Google Docs, which is how I work. And the first draft of the Russia chapter was 27 single-spaced pages. and I was like, and this was me trying to be succinct. So I'm like, okay, now I got a real problem. And what I realized was I didn't need to keep the record again, because I'd already done it once. And what happened was that when you strip out the noise, when you strip out he got fired, they wrote this letter, these people marched there, when you strip that out, what you see is an extraordinarily chilling march of authoritarianism during those years. And it's very, very difficult to read that section. There's not a single person who worked on the book who read that section and didn't say, whew, that was a really hard read, because we came so close. And it really shows in that section.
Yeah, I mean, it was, I feel very much the same way you do, by the way, that, someone asked me once, why do you live tweet his press conferences? why are you writing this stuff? And I'm like, because somebody has to. This all has to be written down. Because otherwise we just say, well, it was a weird time.
You forget. You forget just how bad it was. Even somebody like me who lived it pretty thoroughly, I looked over some of that stuff and the statements that the former president made and the degree to which we have become, as you say, complacent about things even today, like the declaration that the then chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, had committed something akin to treason by refusing to be loyal to President Trump at the time, although he was, in fact, communicating with members of the Defense Department and had their approval for his conversation with his Chinese counterparts. And then to have the former president say that that should be punished, that in the past treason had been punished with death, the clear implication being that the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the most powerful military man in the United States and therefore in the world, should be punished by death if he was not loyal to Donald Trump. That right there should have been headlines for months. And it didn't even make it above the fold in some of our legacy newspapers.
Why do you think that is? Because one of the things that I've wrestled with in years of writing about Trump and reading you've written and others, I don't want to say, well, we've just gotten used to it. But there is almost this kind of dismissal of what he says. This goes back to the infamous, taken seriously but not literally. But you have to take him seriously. I mean, you have to. This is someone who really is laying out a plan to destroy the Constitution.
Today, just today.
We haven't checked. I haven't checked online, but 10 minutes ago.
There were two things today.
But how do you think he accomplised that? I mean, how do you think that happened? Because you talk a lot about the use of language and memory, and I want to get to that. Of course, we had a little chat before, and I definitely want to talk about nostalgia because I think it's such an interesting point you raise. But I still find myself amazed that things that would have been show-stopping scandals and impeachment or a national and ongoing national crisis. I always say that we're in the middle of a national crisis. It's not over. How do you think they accomplished that, Trump and his team and the Republicans?
Well, I think we have to talk about the media and put that aside and talk about that. But I think one of the ways that they managed to do it, and I'd love to hear what you have to say about this, is by declaring ahead of time that they were doing it. I mean, it really wasn't done in secret. So it was very hard, I think, for people to say, oh, gee, he really shouldn't be doing that, when he would come out and say, yeah, I'm gonna break the law. Yeah, I'm gonna do this. And it was hard, I think, for people to listen to that and recognize the enormity of it because it was presented as normal behavior.
And the media has a normalcy bias that you
yes.
couldn't possibly have meant that. This is political rhetoric. It's just part of running for president.
But that this was something that was theorized pretty thoroughly around the time of World War II. That if you made a lie so big or you made a statement that was so big that people couldn't believe anybody would lie about something that big, that you got away with it. Because the comparison I always talk about with my students is, if your roommate steals $20 from you, you get mad about your roommate stealing $20. But if your roommate wipes out your entire family, sells their home, gets your parents thrown out of work, the whole thing, so that they are destitute, you can't believe somebody would actually do that. So it's much harder to react to that and to believe that it really happened than it is just to have someone steal a 20. It was just all so enormous.
One of the most useful books I read at the beginning of all this was The Big Con. The history, the movie The Sting is actually based on a real book, and there really were guys named Gondorf and the Yellow Kid and all that. And it was just amazing that the psychology of getting the people you're conning to say, to actually testify for you, to be so unable to accept the truth. But there's something more to it. And you talk about the way that Trump got us here by deploying things like nostalgia, by deploying language in a very strategic way. And I'm always loath to grant too much intelligence or agency to Donald Trump. I mean this in a serious way. I mean, I do think that the best description of him is kind of as a goldfish, that lives in the present constantly. But
Okay, I've never heard that one.
it just, darting from thing to thing. There's no past, there's no future. It's do the thing now. But amazingly, there was a huge reliance on the past. And that's not new in American politics, right? You talk about this, that nostalgia is this kind of force that can be deployed.
Yes, although
Particularly among conservatives.
I would say, I had not thought of Trump as a goldfish, although now I'm never going to not be able to think of him as a goldfish. I think of him as a salesman. He sells to whatever audience is in front of him. And I can think of a historical character, I think of the same way, that the person could stand right here and say something to me that sounds utterly convincing and turn to you and say something 180 degrees different that convinces you and not believe that he was lying, because everything is about him and selling the product, and in this case, he was the product. And the reason that made him very interesting, I think, as a scholar was because, to me, he reflected to a certain portion of the Republican electorate, the Republican base, what they wanted to see in 2016. He mirrored them. So he gave them
What did they want to see?
Well, the economic correction from the previous 40 years. So he promised economically to have the taxes be fixed so that rich people didn't get away with too much. Remember that, closing the tax loopholes. He promised infrastructure. He promised to bring manufacturing back, and he talked all the time about cheaper and better health care. All of those things were things that spoke to a real economic need. At the same time, of course, he was pushing the sexism and the racism and the othering of the libs, owning the libs. So he had both the economic and the cultural pieces of the discourse that certain base had been exposed to for so long. Then, of course, once he was in office, that rhetorical base became a movement, and he welded that into a movement, which we can talk about. But when you talk about nostalgia, which I think is really interesting, and Tom's written a lot about nostalgia, especially in the last book. The first book was, I don't know if it's your first book, Death of Expertise, is that your first book?
The first book was on Soviet civil-military relations. I don't
Everybody
recommend
knows
that.
that
That was a long time ago. The last book anybody would have read is The Death of Expertise, and then Our Own Worst Enemy.
one. And then Our Own Worst Enemy talks a lot about nostalgia, and with luck, we'll get him talking about Bruce Springsteen. I have that on my back burner to see if we can make happen. But I talk about it as the use of history, not of nostalgia. In that, although I think nostalgia is very important, and I'd like to hear what you have to say about it in terms of the Trump electorate, and the Democrats as well. But what I was arguing is that Trump's heavy use of the concept of 1776, of a perfect past, of a moment in the past where everything was great, which is complete crap. And I always like to say to people, when was that? Well, was it like 2:30 on the afternoon of February 19th in 1923? Because otherwise, I don't really remember a time when everything was perfect for everybody. But that concept that the American Republic sprang out of George Washington's head, fully formed, and it was perfect then, and it was never good again, is, I think, a way it really mirrors the authoritarian use of history to say, look, there's an answer. There's a perfect answer in our past. And we need to get back to that. And the only way we can get back to that is by following a set of rules that are either divine or traditional. And I'm the one who can do that. And anybody who disagrees with me is standing in the way of that. And that is precisely what authoritarians do.
Someone wronged you. The reason your life is the way it is now is because at a particular point, someone wronged you, and I'm going to get even with them.
Now, that's nostalgia. That's different than the use of history, but go ahead with that.
Yeah, the 1776 thing, I mean, I think any of us who spend any time on social media or write and get email, the minute you see 1776 or anything, you go, oh, here we go. You get an email from Eagle 1776, Patriot, Minuteman, you know what it's going to say. But there is this... Yeah, there is this kind of weird attachment to the founding was this perfect moment. But then the Make America Great Again thing was it really struck me how quickly people had no memory of even recent times. You and I are the same age, and it is that, I always said the same thing. So, things were better, and I'm like, when? kids would say, even my students say, well, you grew up in the 60s. That must have been awful or awesome. Or, 60s. And I'm like, it was awful. So what do you remember about the 60s? And I say, no air conditioning.
Well, my 60s were pretty
tents.
good, but okay.
People dying.
Well, okay, I'm going to work it in now. Springsteen.
Springsteen. You want to talk about Springsteen? We got to go there.
My sister is here. She likes Springsteen. Go ahead. Tell us Springsteen.
Well, what Heather's getting at is that and first of all, I'm not disrespecting the boss. Just want to be clear. I know we're in Boston, and sometimes it's a thing, but I love Bruce Springsteen and I love his music. But right? Everything that came before the but is now wiped out. But I am struck by how many times cyclically in Bruce Springsteen's music, and I think this does tie back to the problem of Trump making these appeals. It's like every 10 years, his town dies. Right? I mean, in the 70s, there's a darkness on the edge of town. In the 80s, my hometown has finally been shuttered. In the 90s, they've destroyed my town. I mean, where does this guy live? I mean, it's a nightmare. But it's a touchstone that Trump, and I'm not drawing a link between Trump and Bruce Springsteen. I knew you were going to get me into trouble with this. But that sense that at some point before today, not just the founding, not just 1776, but that my life was so much better. And I want to ask you two things about that. One is that it seems to be something, it's a appeal that seems to resound specifically with conservatives. And we should move to how did this conservative movement get hijacked by a usually Democratic donating Queens, casino boss. But also, this kind of weird sense that I have sometimes that, are we just living through a demographic bump where this is kind of a giant midlife crisis for millions of Americans to say, I'm in my 50s and 60s. Let's face it, most of Trump's voters are older. There's not a lot of young Trumpers. There are some, but I think they're mostly thirsty, attention seekers. But I think that, there is this sense of something's been lost and Trump can give it back to me at a time when my life was really great in like 1988 or something. And I keep saying that doesn't make any sense, but he played that really well.
Okay, so let's divide out what I was just talking about with the history and the idea of an authoritarian history from nostalgia, which I used as a way to talk about rhetoric and the way you create a disaffected population that has been left behind either economically or culturally or socially or religiously or feels itself to be so. And I made the argument—
Or has been told they are over and over again.
Well,
right.
But the told part, I agree with that, but remember who first used the Make America Great Again slogan?
Well, time to do my Reagan imitation.
Yeah.
There you go again.
Yeah.
But this is also where I have to say, and she's right. Let me throw one thing into that mix of, Reagan says, make America great again, at the end of a 10 or 15-year period that begins in the late 1960s, goes through the 70s, which I think were again, people say, oh, you grew up during the 70s. I'm like, yes, I don't want to talk about it. And then says, we can do something different. Trump is the make America great again after a period of expansion and prosperity. And, it would have been like, Bill Clinton in '92 trying to run on Make America Great Again.
So
Do you see the difference I'm drawing?
I do, but I would also suggest that if you actually look at the numbers of the 70s, they were much better than you're letting on. We remember them really poorly, but the reduction of poverty after the Great Society programs, poverty was cut almost in half in the Black community.
True.
So I think
this is all in the book, by the way. I mean, the book really makes this case about the Great Society.
And the more I know, actually, it would be fun to talk about Carter and foreign policy, because Carter's foreign policy, he explicitly, it's not in the book, but I'm reading a lot about Carter these days, he explicitly calls out Reagan and Kissinger for Chile. Look at the look on Tom's face. He's like, what the hell are we talking about?
I know, Adam, listen, I thought he explicitly calls out Reagan. I was waiting to see what the next thing was. What I always found interesting about Reagan and Carter is that they were and I actually said this to a former Carter aide, and he said, oh, he hates it when people say this, but that that the Carter of 1978, 79, 80 and Reagan are actually very much alike on a lot of streams of foreign policy, especially in a very moralizing tone about Soviet communism.
But with a very different underpinning,
yes.
I would argue, because
Right.
Carter's the one who really focuses on human rights.
Right.
Okay, which matters. Anyway, we don't have to talk about that now, but it'd be really fun to talk to Tom about that. Don't you think this is his area of specialty? Nostalgia. But so nostalgia is a tool. It's a tool that is
You're
used.
talking about the Great Society, sorry, that the 70s and how.
Right.
So how is it that, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to break
No,
your
no,
train of thought.
but
how
you're
does-
going the
how
same
does-
direction, I think.
How does Trump get away with hijacking? Well, okay, I think you would take issue with me saying hijacking. You would say he's part of a long stream of development that culminates in Trump.
And then he changes it. So I get both that he is part of a long history of the movement conservative wing of the Republican Party, but then he takes that movement and turns it into an actual cult or an actual
populist cult of some
cult,
kind.
Yeah.
But it's
very deliberately.
Yeah,
through the use
which
of
I think.
through the use
I
of
think
street
this is one
violence.
reason former Republicans, there are a few in the room, but I think it's one reason why you'll hear people like me say hijacked, because what it is now is not recognizable as anything that we would have called conservatism, which I think is such an interesting challenge in your book, because what you really say is, it really is the end result, not what he turned it into with this crazy cult and people putting his head on Stallone's body and all that other kind of creepy stuff, but that what led him to 2016 was actually planted, were seeds that were planted really going back to the failure of Reconstruction.
Yes, but really taking off in the 20th century after Brown versus Board of Education.
Can you say a bit more about that, about picking up in the 20s, but a bit about the failure? Because I think one thing that has really united a lot of critics of the Trump era is thinking about that and saying, wow, this maybe does have some deep historical roots. So how do you get from your point about Reconstruction, of which you are an eminent historian, to the 20s, and then the New Deal, which it plays a very central role in your narrative?
It's going to involve Reagan.
I'm okay. I'm okay with it.
So Tom asked me earlier if the original sin in this book was Reconstruction, and I actually am very fond of original sins coming much earlier than that. But Reconstruction is crucially important because it's during Reconstruction that, everything happens. In fact, that's all any of us really need to study to understand everything. But what happens is
So it's the Big Bang, not the original sin.
That's right, exactly. I mean, ironically, I hated Reconstruction. My first book was on the Civil War because I'm like, nobody can figure this period out. Like, who can tell what's going on? I'm just going to skip it. I'm going to go from the Civil War to the Gilded Age and pretend that that doesn't exist. And then in order to get there, I had to read those newspapers. One thing led to another, and then I wrote another book, and then it turned out I was an expert in Reconstruction, which I guess makes sense because if you hate something and you really have to learn about it, maybe you bring something different to it. But so what happens is, of course, the United States wins on the battlefield, but it never punishes the people who had taken up arms against the United States, the people who tried to establish their own nation, and had cost the United States almost $6 billion and 600,000 lives. There's no penalty for that. They are never punished really in any legal way at all. So what happens is after the war, as Black Americans in the South try to establish, jobs and try to establish homes and bring their families back together. To live, yes, that's where we're going. Of course, in the summer of 1865, former Confederates, white reactionaries, start to attack them and do all sorts of, murders and lynches and rapes, it's an incredibly violent period. And the federal government steps in, and it steps in to through the mechanism of the Freedmen's Bureau, the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, which helps white people as well as black people in the period after the war. It's set up in March of 1865. And when it starts to try and intercede with Southerners to try and deal with the violence of the South, we know from a study of Texas that decides in favor of black Americans about 68% of the time. Historians think that's probably way lower than they ought to have, but they decide in favor of black Americans about 68% of the time. And it's at that point in the summer of '65 that white reactionary Southerners begin to say, hey, we never cared about race. Race was never an issue. What we really care about is an overreaching federal government. This was all about making sure the federal government stayed small. Well, in the summer of that year of '65, as the southern states are writing their new state constitutions, they do so, but then of course they go on to establish the Black Codes. And the Black Codes are not the same thing as the Jim Crow laws, but the Black Codes are state laws that essentially remand enslaved Americans into second-class citizenship. On the heels of that, under Andrew Johnson, the president, the southern states are invited to send senators and representatives back to Congress for the session that's going to begin in December of 1865, because Johnson's in charge from April when Lincoln's assassinated through December when Congress gets back in session. And they literally re-elect the same people who ran the Confederacy. So not only were they not punished, now they are going back to Congress, including the Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, who's been elected as a senator from Georgia. So they are going to have more power after the war than they did before the war, because by the census of 1870, African Americans are going to be counted as full people rather than as 3/5 of a person. So literally, they are more powerful after the war than they were before the war. When the North looks at this, and Congress looks at this, they say, we cannot have this, and this is where we get the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. You knew I was going somewhere, right? The 14th Amendment establishes that the federal government will make sure the states do not discriminate against citizens in them. They have to be treated equally before the laws, and they have the due process of the laws and the equal protection of the laws. And the federal government is going to protect that. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitutions are the first in our Constitution that increase the power of the federal government rather than decreasing the power of the federal government.
And you make the point in your book that this is where the Republicans, who are going to become the villains of this story pretty quickly, yet as you point out, they set out a claim here for equality.
That's correct.
That there is this interesting passage in Democracy Awakening where you point out that these 19th century Republicans actually kind of seize this moment to stake the claim for equality, and yet somehow it denatures and corrodes very quickly. So how does
what happens after the 14th gets added to the Constitution in 1868 is that the reactionary white Southerners try to keep those newly empowered black Americans, especially black men who can vote under the Military Reconstruction Act of 1867, from exercising their political rights. And they do so by dressing up as the ghosts of former Confederates. That's why they wear those stupid sheets. That's what they're up to, is they're supposed to look like the ghosts of former Confederates coming and...
Here I am.
Historian! And they did all kinds of stupid things to look like they were ghosts, whatever. But when that happens, we get the 14th Amendment, and then in 1870 we get not only the 15th Amendment to the Constitution guaranteeing the right of black men to vote, we also get the establishment of the Department of Justice, which says that we're going to come after you as the federal government if you are attacking your black neighbors.
Uh-oh.
How we doing? Okay.
Back
if we're going to come after you if you attack your black neighbors, and the Department of Justice starts to operate in the South, and it prosecutes more than 3,000 white KKK members. So what happens then, that's 1870. 1871, and the reason that I see this as one of the real original sins, is that white Southerners start to say, hey, we don't have any problem with our black neighbors on race. We never had a problem with that. These are the exact same people who the year before were with the KKK. They say, no, our problem is that they are poor and they don't have property, and if they vote, they're going to vote for politicians who promise to give them schools and hospitals and roads and prosthetics. Actually, a really big thing in the South after the war is prosthetics. The United States was the leader in world development of prosthetics in the 19th century because of our Civil War. It is again now, by the way.
So what happens that gets that Republican Party in the 1920s? Because you said the 20s, somehow this, early and post-Lincoln relatively virtuous Republican Party, something happens in the 20s.
So they start to say that we're not against people based on race, we're against people based on poverty. That if poor people vote, they're going to vote for politicians who are going to give them public goods.
They're going to rob Peter to pay, right.
But they start to use the word socialism. This is socialism because the people who are going to be paying for it are white people who have property. There are going to be taxes levied on them to provide goods and services for poor people, primarily poor people of color, black people in the American South. Literally in 1871, they start to use the word socialism, long before your people start running around.
Pretty early. I mean, that's, yeah.
But it's not about economic socialism, it's about politics, who gets to vote. And that's really important because in contrast to that Eastern socialism, we get on the other hand the rise in the West of somebody who's dead set against socialism, right? The American cowboy, who rises in 1866 and is going to ride the range until about 1886, 1887. And they begin to lionize the American cowboy as somebody who wants nothing from the government, which is ridiculous. The cowboys depend on the government, and who simply wants to work hard, use his gun to defend his womenfolk, and work hard to prosper. And that stands against that big Eastern government that constitutes socialism, and I am talking about the 1870s. That imports really beautifully to the movement conservative project in the United States in the 1950s after Brown versus Board of Education, especially during the Cold War. The Eastern government is a socialist government where communism is creeping in from the Soviet Union and China at that period, or so the argument goes. And it is using the federal government to do things like bring the troops into Little Rock Central High School in 1957 to support the integration of that public school. And what stands against that? The American who stands up on his own, who wants nothing of the government except to protect his womenfolk and pretty soon to have his own gun. And we get the rise in the 1950s and the 1960s of all those television westerns, including Bonanza, which is the first syndicated television show in color and goes all around the world. And that cultural move from Reconstruction to the 1950s, I think we're still seeing play out.
So one of the things I love about talking with you is that you have the same kind of touchstones in pop culture that I do, because I think the pop culture tells you so much about what's actually, happening at the moment. And I think that's an interesting point about the westerns of the 50s. I was looking at it's a total digression for a moment, but I love vintage television. So I have all these old, MeTV and all that stuff, and I was amazed, just acres of westerns in the 50s and 60s. It's all it is. Rawhide and The Rifleman and Bonanza, and I'm like, wow, this.
Well, and then in 1974, we get the television adaptation of Little Town on the Prairie, when Pa, who was literally Little Joe in Bonanza.
I was going to ask you about this. It's in the book.
Becomes the dad, although, and if you are a real lover of Laura Ingalls Wilder, please cover your ears. Because Pa's a total loser, right? In reality, he lives on the money that his daughters and his wife bring home. He never manages to accomplish anything in his life. But in that, he becomes in that television series, he is the epitome of the good, strong family man. And we get this adaptation into popular culture in which things like, girls start to wear gunny sacks. Did you ever, your prom, did you wear gunny sacks dresses and the prairie dresses and those stupid little sunbonnets?
You are the first person who's ever gotten me to think that Little House on the Prairie is a reactionary screed, which is kind of amazing. But let's tease that out more to get back to where we are today, because again, Republicans would say, some Republicans would say, but there's Eisenhower, right, saying that's adopting the same position that the Republicans of the 1870s would have.
No, Eisenhower didn't, because remember, the party splits pretty dramatically.
Right.
Okay.
So let's talk about that because, in some of the discussion we've had about things like regional sorting and the Northeastern, when you said big Northeastern businesses, I thought Republicans. The Eastern Syndicate.
Literally, the Eastern establishment
Right.
was supposed to be the Eastern businessmen who had thrown the election of the Republican nomination of 1952 to Eisenhower rather than to Robert Taft of Ohio, who was the heir presumptive.
Let me phrase it
and they
differently.
start to say, we hate the Eastern establishment. And who they were referring to Cabot Lodge, Henry Cabot Lodge.
Henry Cabot Lodge. But in that sweep from kind of the 1870s into the 1950s and 1960s, and I think you could argue, as you do, and even diehard conservatives would have to agree with you, there's a certain reactionary streak that starts to develop right among Republicans, literally reacting to change. Was there any place where there was an off-ramp? Was there any moment in those 50 or 70 years that things could have been different? Because one of the things that struck me about your argument is that there's a kind of dreadful inevitability to it all. That's why I phrased it in terms of original sin. That once the sweep of history begins, you're saying, yeah, this isn't going to end well.
Well, the first section of this starts in 1937,
Right.
and yes, it starts by talking about how Republicans and Democrats agreed on everything basically after World War II, but
As a class matter, I mean, because race is very important to your
Right.
narrative.
Right, but it is worth remembering that this book was designed to talk about the present. How did we get here? Where are we? And how do we get out? And in fact, in my history of the Republican Party, there not only are off-ramps, the party switches back to being a Lincoln Party. Repeatedly, it does that. And so, in terms of off-ramps, sure, the election of 1883 is enormously important because a number of young Republicans kept saying, we can't live with the party the way it is. It's become a big business party, and we're going to reform it from within. And there are people, like Henry Cabot Lodge, the first, the senior, and Theodore Roosevelt, who do, in fact, manage to reclaim a progressive Republican Party. And one of the things that I think is so interesting in this moment and in so many, and so for so many years, people would say to me, for years, people would say, is the Republican Party dead? And I'd say, nope, it's about to be reborn, because that's what it's always done in the past. And if you look at the successes of the Republican Party, they are almost always in those periods when they are standing again on the original Lincolnian principles. And the fact that those are not the moments that the party is lionizing now, I've never quite understood why they don't, I understand why they don't now, but why they didn't champion Eisenhower. Like, if you had the guy who won World War II on your team, wouldn't he be the headliner? And instead, they treated him like he was Elmer Fudd, and instead talked about how great Coolidge was. And by nobody's stretch of any imagination was Coolidge a hero.
We should talk, before we get to the Q&A, because we're going to do that, we should talk about how we wow, okay. Probably not going to get to all these, but we'll try. About how we get out of this, which is the third part of the book. But as you were talking about Eisenhower and kind of that sweep through the mid-century, the other word, in addition to nostalgia and history, that I think crops up in my mind thinking about this is resentment. That there is a resentfulness that seems, and again, something probably as a Republican once in my life I should have paid more attention to, but that there is almost this kind of, why didn't we get behind Eisenhower? Well, because everybody else wanted to, and because he was, because he was a general, and because he was a university president, he's the establishment. Because one of the things I find amazing about now is the degree to which the Republicans, and Richard Nixon must be spinning in his grave, that the Republicans have become a countercultural movement,
Yeah,
right?
that's fair.
They're like the new anti-establishment kind of.
Anti-hero. I was telling you about anti-heroes.
Yes, anti-heroes. Well,
Yeah.
that's coming back to Springsteen. Yep.
That's right. That's how we got on it.
But why is that? I mean, has that always been there? Because if you'd taken somebody from 1965 and said, listen, the Republican Party is going to be the countercultural movement of 2023, they would have found that almost impossible to believe, but I think what you're telling us is there are seeds of that even then.
Yes, but there's no inevitability to anything in the future. I mean,
Not
that's
inevitable,
just but yes, there were seeds of it. I do not think it was inevitable. I think that it's possible for any number of people. I mean, it was the Democratic Party that was resentful in the 1850s. And certainly up until 1879. I mean, we talked before about an important change that the party makes in 1880. But I want to ask you about, it's interesting because Eisenhower does figure in this book quite heavily, but in the last section. So all the resentment and all the nostalgia and all the really negative stuff is in the first two sections, and the whole third section is how you reclaim and expand democracy. And there's Eisenhower, and there's Theodore Roosevelt, and there's all those strands, and it doesn't seem to have made an impression.
It doesn't, right. I mean, the Republicans of 2023 couldn't care less about Dwight Eisenhower or Roosevelt. And I don't, like you, I'm somewhat baffled, except that I think that if you're a countercultural movement, you don't go back to, such an establishment figure. And I think with Roosevelt, I think there's just a vacuum of historical knowledge. If you say to the average person, they tell me about Teddy Roosevelt.
Yeah, well, but I'm not sure I'm asking you this, but it does seem to me that the modern day Republican Party has given up on the democratic project and it has to be written off.
It's funny. We should lift the curtain a little bit, and because when we were talking before, and Heather and I have been in a conversation for years about this stuff, and I said, so, when we first began this journey of, my God, where are we? What's happening?
Which is probably before, was it before Trump?
I think it was right about there. I think it was 2015, 2016.
Did I review The Death of Expertise or something? Maybe.
Pardon?
I might have reviewed The Death of Expertise. That might have been How We Met or something.
Maybe, yeah, no, that's
So what year was
2017.
that?
But we've at least 6, 7 years we've been having this conversation, and Heather is just nicer and gentler than I am, because I was an early advocate of just sort of shunning and kind of writing off and saying there's no reasoning with this. And what I find interesting is that when I asked you, where you were, we've kind of come to the same place about this, that this is essentially an unreformable party. So the last thing, while I'm going to check through some of these, looking at the third part of your book, how would you reconstruct not just a healthy center-right party, because I think one thing that people would find striking is we both agree there has to be a center-right party of some kind in America. But also a center-left party. I mean, how would you reconstruct that in a way that now makes sense to be able to recapture people's participation in politics, along with whatever you'd like to say about that last part of the book?
So you're asking about what that would look like, not literally how I would go about doing it.
Right, what it would look like.
Because I've thought of this about how you would literally go about doing it, too. So this is a real question, because scholars of democracy and political scientists will, I shouldn't have said as if they were different, but will tell you that you need to have at least 2 political parties to have a healthy democracy, because they check each other, first of all. That is, you are always watching the other party like a hawk, and the ways in which that doesn't happen you can see right now in states like Florida, which is a one-party state, and as a result it's one of the corrupt. Between that and they and Ohio compete to be the most corrupt state in the union, although Mississippi's been given them a run for their money recently. And you will see those are all one-party states. So you want there to be checks on the other party, but you also want people in a democracy to feel that they have a realistic chance of getting their people in office again. Because if they don't have that, they stop paying attention to democracy, they stop having faith in democracy, and they fall away from it, and the democracy dies. That's a really simple answer to, or a very simple version of why it's important to have at least 2 political parties. Now, in the American system, it's hard to have more than that, because in order for somebody to run the United States of America, you need to have a lot of different people who have a lot of expertise. So it's not like you can say, I'm going to be the pothole party and I'm going to have people who are really, really, really good at roads. People are not going to put you in office unless you can say, yes, I can also handle the Fed. And that's hard to do if you're a much smaller third party. Anyway, that being said, what do you do in this moment where one of our traditional parties that's been around since the 1850s has given up on the democratic project and has become, I mean, I didn't even have the words for it, really.
I think
organized crime?
I think one of the things that I find so striking about, no, organized crime is actually efficient.
That's fair.
They know how to pave the streets. But one of the things I find so striking about the modern conservative movement, when I was a 20-year-old, again, we're the same age, my first election was 1980, I was struck by the Daniel Patrick Moynihan quote that is not, I don't think it's in your book, but Moynihan saying,
I don't think so.
The Republicans have become the party of ideas. And there was this confidence, there was this kind of can-do, of course our ideas are right. I think they've not only given up on democracy, I think they really don't think they can sell what they're selling. They don't think anybody's going to buy that. And
they're right.
And they're right, exactly. They can't sell it. Nobody wants to buy it. So they're saying, fine, we'll just do this through minority rule. And the manipulation of, I think we would both agree, most of the US Constitution is an agreement rather than black letter law. It's governed by norms. And the Republicans have said, good, we'll just use that to our advantage. So I think that's right. For me, a center-right party would have to have at least a certain amount of self-confidence to say, yeah, we can take losses, but we'll be back, and our ideas are good. And that our ideas are better than the other guy, but the other guy isn't evil. But that has been lost, and I think that happened. This is about your book, but I think looking at it, I think part of it is just demographic change. That they're just looking and saying, we just can't win elections. And we certainly can't win them on. Both of you and I were laughing about the dog catching the car on abortion, for example. They just didn't expect that to happen, and now it's like, well, we're stuck with this, so now we just have to ram things through anti-democratic means.
So Tom made the point earlier that what we really are waiting for is the demographic change that's going to move this reactionary, undemocratic group of people off stage. Interestingly enough, somebody said to me the other day, well, shouldn't America have a party that represents the racists and the sexists and the evangelical Christians and all that? Which I thought was an interesting question. And my conclusion was no. That
well considered.
Well, if you're a country that is a democracy, then no, you shouldn't have a political party that is anti-democratic. That is antithetical to the entire national project. That being said, I do think, and I've always maintained, I really thought the Republican Party would rebuild itself from within the way it has done in the way it did repeatedly in the 1890s and 1920s, period after World War II. The time was right for it to rebuild, and obviously it went down the authoritarian path instead. But the ideology of the Republican Party as it was articulated by Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, beginning in 1859 through the Civil War, is as central to our DNA as the ideology of the Democrats, which is from a much earlier period in answer to different series of problems. They are not black and white. I think of them as a line in a circle, to be honest. It's very rare that they are the exact opposite of each other. There's a couple of elections in the 1880s in which they really are mirror images of each other. But for the most part, the ideology of the Republicans will be reborn. It just may not be reborn with a party that calls itself the Republicans. And I was really interested during the speaker fight, the House speaker fight, somebody came out of the right, what I would consider the conservative Republicans, who still believe in democracy, and said it's time to start a new party called the Constitutional Conservatives. And I was fascinated by that because, first of all, it's a terrible name, but second of all, because that's the first time I've heard a Republican say that. There are plenty of Democrats who've been saying it for a long time, but that was the first time I heard a Republican say we need to start a new party.
I've always thought it's kind of just a glib answer to say, well, why should there be a center-right party of racism, sexism? Look, we're always going to disagree. How big should government be? The left and the right are going to reach different answers about what should government do. How strong should the central government be, in a federal system? Those are, I look forward to the days when you and I, to a day, I hope we can come back here and instead of saying, oh my God, is democracy doomed? And we can sit here and argue about marginal tax rates and, how big the government ought to be.
Exactly.
And I think that you need two functioning parties because without them, they do try to extinguish each other. They say and I think one of the things that really is striking to me is the apocalyptic, we didn't get to this because I wish we were gonna be here for the next 3 hours, but the apocalyptic tone. If you lose this election, civilization is doomed. No, you know, that's a relatively new thing, right? Nobody was saying that,
It's a new thing, but I don't think in this case, coming up to 2024, it is illegitimate on the part of those of us who are very concerned about the election of Trump or a Trump-like figure.
Exactly. I mean, look, we are part of the pro-democracy coalition. I think if Trump is reelected in 2024, American democracy is functionally doomed. But what I find striking about the argument about should there be right and left parties is that and the right has now really trademarked this, is a loss on anything to the other party is Armageddon.
Right.
Let's get to some questions, and I want to do I'm going to do some of them where I think you could do a kind of longer answer, but I want to hit you with a few lightning round questions because some of these are really cool. So real quick, why does Thomas Jefferson bother you so much?
Thomas Jefferson pisses me off not for all the obvious reasons. He and Salmon P. Chase are the two villains in. Okay, it's like you didn't see that
I'm
one
just
coming,
loving
did
it.
you?
It's like Thomas Jefferson, that guy.
That's right.
I just because
Well,
as you can imagine, I am not a huge fan of Thomas Jefferson either.
I'd like to know why, actually.
Well, because the populist agrarian ideal. I'm a John Adams.
No,
I'm a John Adams guy.
So I'm not even weighing any of his ideas or anything. It's that he was so freaking smarmy, and so what makes me nuts about him, and the same thing that Salmon P. Chase did, Secretary of the Treasury under Lincoln, later on the Supreme Court, is he would just needle. He would just needle George Washington. George Washington desperately wanted to go home. He hated being president. He hated being stuck in the city. And Jefferson would go up and be like, oh, I know you love it here, but me, I need to go back to my beautiful Virginia home. And you can stay here where you're so happy. And they'd be like, hee hee hee. And then he comes to him at one point and goes, do you know people have started political parties, and this is a terrible thing. Who started the political party? Thomas Jefferson. It's like, and Salmon P. Chase does the same thing. It's
Sounds like the worst graduate seminar student that you get once a year. You just wish you just wanted to shut up.
It's just like I don't care what your position is, but be honest about it. And Thomas Jefferson was never honest with anyone about anything, and that pisses me off.
Well, As an ardent supporter of Mr. Adams, I'm with you in spirit. Assess the influence, this won't be a long answer, but it came up in our earlier discussion, the power and influence of Steve Bannon.
So Steve Bannon is really an interesting character. He took over Breitbart, of course, and Breitbart was always right-leaning, but under Andrew Breitbart, it was not deliberately pushing this worldview that Steve Bannon is pushing, this idea of destroying democracy as he is trying to do. Really interesting to watch Bannon. He talked early on about how important it was to do things like make coalitions with the radical Putinists in Russia, et cetera, et cetera. But what's interesting to me about Bannon right now is, of course, his War Room podcast is a cesspool. It's really, but it's worth taking a look at Steve Bannon right now. I was looking I was watching parts of War Room the other day, as one does. He looks horrible. He looks, there is, and we were talking about this before, I'm not very good about telling when people have substance abuse issues. It doesn't jump out to me, but I was watching it with someone, and the person said, oh my God, he's taking drugs and chasing it with alcohol. And I'm like, how can you tell? And they're like, because I used to work in a rehab facility. And I'm like, well, I wouldn't know anything about that. But it's interesting the degree to which so many members of the Trump coalition look like
they're decaying in front of our eyes.
And act like they need interventions.
Yeah.
And
when you mentioned that earlier, I immediately thought of Rudy. Yeah.
Rudy Giuliani, Don Jr., and honestly, one of the things that gives me a lot of hope about the upcoming election is lots of people haven't actually seen former President Trump really since 2017 when he became president. He was very tightly wrapped. He was very tightly handled. You listen to him now, he is a mess.
We had a question here about media, and so I'm going to fold all of that into a media question because one of the things I find striking about this is, Joe Biden trips over a word, and it's like, well, there it is. He's, he's on death's door. Donald Trump goes off like a Roman candle of nuttiness and doesn't know who he's talking about, starts doing funny voices, kind of, trips out. And I think this goes back to our earlier point about the success of the Trump movement saying, well, what are you going to do? That's just normal. And I think I hate the word normalize, but I'm going to use it. We've normalized this. And I don't understand. I'm not sure what the role of the media is going to be here going to 2024, pretending as if this is just a normal race between two normal candidates.
Well, the media hasn't really picked up on his current state. And I think if you watch him with his audiences, I always think of it as being a very aging rock star preaching to the people who loved him in the past. And for all that people didn't like Donald Trump, he was great with an audience, at least in 2016. He really read the audience. He fed the audience. That's all gone. Now it's all just grievance and as you say, nuttiness. And I think the media is going to have a field day with him, to be honest. But you know what I think is interesting on this? Not Trump related, but have you noticed the degree to which the media and people who otherwise are not willing to speak up have gone after the new Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson? And I find that really interesting because Johnson does not have a network around him the way even Kevin McCarthy did. And people didn't dare or certainly media didn't dare to touch people like Kevin McCarthy, who, has lots of skeletons in his closet. But Mike Johnson, we've already gotten all of his podcasts. We've already gotten his personal life. And it's been 3 days.
His unusual finances.
His very unusual finances.
But I'm going to throw a flag here and say, and yet I was shocked, and I wrote about this in The Atlantic, a fine magazine, by the way. That I was just shocked by the Washington Post going to a diner in Shreveport, Louisiana. And darn the luck,
his mother.
darn the luck, who happens to be in the diner that day? Mike Johnson's mother.
Yes.
And I thought, as I wrote in the piece, this is really nice. My mom used to say nice things about me, too.
Yeah.
But I just thought to myself, here we go again. It's like, well, what kind of guy is in his speech? Well, let's go to a diner in his hometown full of people who know him, sitting with his mom. And I thought, that's just a fail. There's something wrong there. Why can't or won't the I might steal this question from you, but let's both take it. Why can't or won't the Republican legislators denounce Trump?
Do you want to start that one? And
Because they're deathly afraid of their own voters.
Yes, I'm with that. They're deathly afraid of their own voters.
And we're both stealing that point from George Will, who made, I think, a very,
Actually, I'm stealing it from somebody else, but okay.
Will made a couple of years ago, he said it's the first time in history that a major American party, the leaders of a major American party fear their own voters.
And not just, they fed this beast, and now they're physically afraid of that beast. And you can see with things like Jim Jordan's quest for speaker, him threatening people. But they're also, as Tom was pointing out earlier, afraid to go home to their homes and be ostracized.
Or literally afraid to go home.
Yes. And their whole lives would be messed up if they had to go back to their base and say things like, the election wasn't stolen. And you see that from the Fox News channel. They started out by saying the election wasn't stolen and took such a hit for it, they changed their minds.
Well, we were talking backstage about Ken Buck, he's saying all the right things, right? And he gets so close, he gets right to the edge.
A representative from Colorado who has just announced today that he is not going to run for re-election because, gosh darn it, he doesn't like that the party has embraced election denial. 3 days ago, he voted for Mike Johnson. Who was the key to the,
Let's go a little deeper here.
They were threatening to primary him because he wasn't cool enough on other issues.
Well, and I think the other problem is, to answer your question about legislate, what these Republican legislators want to do? They want to pass bills. They want to cut taxes. They want to do things. They want to do stuff.
Marjorie Taylor Greene does not want to pass bills.
Right.
She wants to be in front of the cameras. And here's the question that maybe somebody has asked, and if not, I'll ask it. Do you think they're ever going to fund the government? Because they want to
let me write it down. What is it?
Do you think they're ever going to fund the government? Or is this whole...
I have a question right here asking if they're ever going to fund the government. And yes, I think they'll fund the government, but your point is well taken. There are two Republican parties, and the sedition-adjacent kooky party gets the votes of the other party because they say, look, we got to just get past this so we can actually do the stuff that our donors and interests and, basically doing normal Congress stuff. And so they just kind of eat that problem, but I think they will fund the government in these. I think they like these ongoing crises where the government's funded, 45 days at a time, and then they can start arguing about all the red meat and hot button issues.
I'm just wondering, after the funding bill of 2 days ago that was just an absolute non-starter, I'm wondering, they shut down the government for 3 weeks in the middle of a crisis. And it wasn't called a shutdown, but it was a shutdown. Congress couldn't do anything. And I'm looking at those 12 appropriations bills? Yeah, 12 appropriations bills that need to get through. And the Senate's already done their job. And although the Republican negotiators announced she's not going to run for re-election today, but the House hasn't done anything.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there's an interesting dynamic here where a lot of these folks think, you know what? We can go home and say, I voted, the reason the bill was non-starter is they linked foreign aid to defunding the IRS, basically, which, okay, fine. It's not going to happen. But then they can go home and say, well, I voted to defund the IRS, and then they count on other people to be competent and responsible and do it all behind the scenes and out. Guys like Matt Gaetz, I think this is right, and Marjorie Taylor Greene, they don't care about passing bills. They don't care about not passing bills. They just care about the kind of performance art of all this. So
but they can stop things. They care about, they've told their base that they're going to stop this behemoth federal government and they're going to make it go away. And But
they count on the fact that the people they're talking to don't know if the government's been stopped or not.
Yes, but I think at this point we no longer, see, look at me being harsher than Tom Nichols. I think at this point we can no longer believe in a good faith attempt either to do things like put military officers in the positions to which they need to be promoted, or ambassadors. It is astonishing that those things have not happened.
Yeah,
they
I
are
would have
hurting
stopped.
us.
I will get back over on the harsh side of the car with you and say, could have just stopped that. We just can't count on good faith.
Yeah, well, but when you have a party that has garnered power by deciding that it's going to shut down, that it's going to stop this government that they all say they hate, even though they really don't, who's the guy who finally says, oh yeah, I didn't really mean that? And I worry that these people will never say that.
And we need to move on to these other questions. You know who the unlikely hero of this story is today?
I can't wait.
Is Mitch McConnell.
Yeah.
It's so strange. Mitch McConnell saying, no, we have to be responsible and we have to pass these bills. And I'm thinking, well, in the immortal words of Bruce Willis, welcome to the party, pal.
Yeah.
Let me ask you an optimistic question from the audience. Do you see signs that American democracy is alive and functioning well? And if so, where?
Here. I do. And so this is a really interesting development in that we are here talking because of what we do for a living, talking about people in Congress and focusing on what's happening in Washington and all the crises that we are facing, and they are indeed crises. And I just have to say, we have not mentioned President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris, and we are so freaking lucky that they are in office in this crisis time. And I could go on about that. Even though I was not originally a supporter, I have become one, especially in Biden's handling of foreign affairs and domestic affairs. So anyway, but one of the things that I think the crisis of the moment has created is an extraordinary groundswell around the country of people who are determined to reclaim their democracy. And
almost as if democracy is awakening.
You'd be surprised. And what it reminds me of is the 1850s. And in the 1850s, if you lived in 1853, you would think that the elite enslavers had gotten everything. They had the Supreme Court, they had the presidency, they had the Senate, and they were making inroads on the House of Representatives. And They were very articulate about the fact they believed in a society in which a few rich guys should run the society for everybody else and take all the wealth that everybody was creating because they were the ones who really knew how things should work. And they had all the nodes of power. They ran the southern states, they really looked like they had taken everything over, and they were going to spread their system around the globe, and they're really articulate about that. 1854, they managed to get through the House of Representatives a law that says that they're going to spread their system of enslavement over the West. And when they do that, the Westerners and the Southerners will make slavery national. They'll clean out the North as well. And then they're going to make the whole system global. But Americans woke up in 1854, and they began to organize and look at each other. Lincoln talks about this, look at each other and say, we don't agree about immigration, we don't agree about financing, we don't agree about internal improvements, but by God, we agree that we do not want to be an oligarchy. We want to be a democracy. And by 1856, they have a new political party, the Republicans. By 1859, Abraham Lincoln has articulated a new vision of government that works for ordinary Americans rather than just for those very few people on top. By 1861, he has been elected to the White House. By 1863, he has signed the Emancipation Proclamation, ending human enslavement as a system, an economic system in the United States. And by the end of 1863, he has given the Gettysburg Address calling for a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, and promising a new birth of freedom. Less than 10 years. And while we honor Lincoln for his role in that, and people always talk about how brilliant Lincoln is, Lincoln did it because ordinary Americans got together and said, not on our watch. And I look around what's happening in America today at the millions of people in all sorts of organizations that are not being covered by the legacy press. And I think we're doing the exact same thing today. And that's why I think democracy is awakening.
And I'll just I'll throw one more constitutional point on the pile, which is that where democracy is functioning well, a place that conservatives and liberals all used to disagree about, but boy, federalism's looking pretty good right about now. That the ability of a really strong central government simply to, and this, when Trump came in and said we're going to do this, that the states went, yeah, no.
Yeah.
That I think that's been a very positive sign. I mean, oftentimes people say, how worried are you, about where? I said, well, I live in New England, almost with this kind of, pride almost to say, well, I don't worry about that a lot where I live, but if democracy falls apart, it will fall apart in pieces in various regions rather than nationally because of the structure of our government and the genius of the founding. So I think, federalism is something to think about here. This is a bit of a hot button question. Can you talk a bit about the election of President Obama and his 8-year presidency and what that has to do with the rise of Trump?
So Obama, of course, was a really fascinating character in that in many ways he represented what the Republican Party had been originally founded to guarantee. That is the idea that a man of color could rise to the presidency of the United States was in many ways a fulfillment of exactly what Abraham Lincoln had talked about. But from the very beginning, there was that reactionary element to his election. The idea that we were taxed enough already, the Tea Party, right? The idea that somehow we could get back to a past in which we would not, ooh, did you hear that? There's like an echo here. All of a sudden I'm God. That we could get back to a past in which we were not going to be governed by a socialist, because there, once again, you had the linkage of race and class to say that the election of a black man to the White House to run the federal government was going to bring socialism to America. And in fact, that's the reason I wrote the Republican book, my history of the Republican Party, is because when he was elected, everybody was holding up signs, or all these people were holding up signs saying, Obama's a socialist, and we've been taxed enough already. There's socialism in the White House. And I'm like, he is not a socialist. He is to the right of Eisenhower.
I have this argument with a lot of my, conservative brethren, where I would say, he's, he's almost a one-percenter president in some ways, aside, obviously healthcare and some of the larger social programs. But I kept looking at them and saying, what are you talking about? But I want to ask a corollary to that question then to add on to this. Do you think that when people say socialism, I always assume that they just don't know what the hell they're talking about.
No, I think they're talking about exactly what I was talking about earlier in 1871. And what gets picked up in the 1950s as well, and into the 1960s, the idea that that there is this linkage in the United States between race and class. And so if you have poor people electing a president, they are going to vote for programs that cost tax dollars. They're going to be paid for by people who have property, usually people who are white, at least until very recently. And that, therefore, is a redistribution of wealth from rich people to poor people, from white people to black people, or people of color, or women who want to work outside the home. And that is a form of socialism. And that political concept, rather than an economic concept of socialism, I think is exactly what was triggered by the election of a man of color. And that's a really big deal. I think there's a cultural sense that if you let black people vote, or brown people vote, or certain women vote, you are going to destroy American democracy and usher in socialism. And this is absolutely the language that you see with the Republican Party beginning in 1986 when they start ballot integrity measures. You see it with the motor voter. 1993. You see it? Can you do me?
All right.
I should be on.
There we go. Now you're on.
You see it with the Motor Voter Act of 1993, with the idea that that Democrats are picking up voters in welfare organizations in order to pad their majorities. In 1994, you start to see the Republicans going after Democrats.
Is that an economic or cultural anxiety? Because one of the things that always struck me among the people on the right, the Republicans I knew weren't, I was not a huge fan of big government programs and Obama's general plans, right? I didn't freak out when he became president, but I had my disagreements with his policies. But it seems to me that some of this is cultural anxiety disguised as anxiety about redistribution. That here's this, he's not just a black man, he's educated, he's well-spoken, he's very self-confident, which really pissed off a lot of people, right? That, he just kind of walked out there and was like, he had this attitude of, I know you don't like me, that's the way it goes. And that rubbed a few Democrats the wrong way as well. But I wonder if there was a cultural aspect to this of not just a black man, but a black man who thinks he's better than I am.
I think that's absolutely the case, but I think it comes from this idea that on the one hand, theoretically, we believe in the United States that everybody has been created equal and has the right to be treated equally before the law and have a say in their government. And at the same time, there are these vestiges, not vestiges right now, they're very active elements of our society that say that, in fact, some people really are better than others, and the people who are not as good as those people ought to act like it.
That leads to a question. How did and I'm glad we went down that road, how did the economic dislocation of the non-college educated contribute to Trump's rise? And I will say that I disagree with the premise of this question about the economic dislocation, but there is an issue here with the non-college educated and Trump's rise. And that it used to be that, and this goes back to the narrative about how did the Republicans become what they are now, that Republicans had a reputation of being kind of the elitist, Eastern, nobody inveighed against this more than Richard Nixon, of all people, right? The Eastern Ivy League, the goddamn, Harvard and all of that. And now it is the party that is primarily, that at least the Trumpist movement identifies heavily with non-college educated men, especially.
So I think that's a really complicated question, and I want to point you to Will Bunch's book called Beyond the Ivory Tower, in which he really tries to unpack that. I don't agree with everything he ended up with, but I think the statistics he uses are important and very interesting. But I would argue that this is part of the modern day Republican movement. The idea is, like Nixon certainly inveighed against education, but so did Ronald Reagan. He really took potshots at Harvard all the time. And the idea that you are just as good as those people who look down on you. And by the way, that concept—
William F. Buckley, rather be governed by the Boston phone book than the— And yet
William
all of them went to Harvard and Yale and Cornell and Columbia.
And James Buchanan. I'm sorry, not James Buchanan. Pat Buchanan. Sorry, slipped there. Pat Buchanan very deliberately said to Nixon that they could whip up populist fervor by saying those people hate you. those people don't like you, and you should stick with us because those people, those rich elites don't like you. And I heard this from someone actually this summer and said, well, you people all hate us. And I said, have you ever heard somebody say that? Because I live with those people. I've never once heard anybody say, we don't like those people. I've never heard them refer to it.
Who's this you people? When people say this to me, they're like, you elite, I'm like, I'm from Chicopee.
Right. So I think it's an artificial construction, but I think it's an artificial construction that married very easily into the evangelical movement, because the evangelical movement
should have been talking about them,
has had and there's not much of that in this book, but the evangelical movement in the United States has a very, very long history going back, obviously, to the colonial era, and certainly to the First Great Awakening and the early period in the country. And it was incredibly important because buried in that frontier evangelicism was the idea that those Easterners didn't like us. Those Easterners were educated, and they had let educations get between them and God. And they were only interested in money, and they were interested in style and class. And those of us on the frontier, we're the authentic Americans. And that concept, of course, plays itself out across the country throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century. And I know exactly where I was when I heard that Sarah Palin had been nominated to be, or McCain had tapped her to be his vice president. And I said to the person I was with, nobody in the East understands what Western evangelicism is, because I used to be a waitress in Oklahoma, and those are the people I worked with. And the whole concept of, I don't want an education because it's going to stand between me and God. I don't want a decent job because then I'll only care about, and mind you, these people couldn't get decent jobs because they weren't educated. But it became a badge of honor. And that badge of honor, and then the other piece that goes with that is homeschooling. The idea that you don't actually need an education. I mean, it's almost like there was this death of expertise at some point.
Hell of a book title. It's interesting you say that, because one of the people who talked about this reverse snobbery of educated people are bad, and salt of the earth people are good. Interestingly enough, before he decided to sell his soul for ambition was J.D. Vance.
Yes.
And he talked about it, and then decided he didn't want to talk about that anymore. And I think it's interesting too, and there's some great work being done by people like David French and others who are talking about how is it that the evangelical movement, after all of that, chooses Donald Trump.
But it is played out. I mean, I don't have to tell you this, but of course it's played out not only in politics, but also in all kinds of science. The idea that, we can't trust our doctors any longer. We can't trust the infectious disease specialists. Vaccines all of a sudden are suspect. It's truly, for a historian who has actually seen pictures of what smallpox used to do and what polio used to do, the idea that we're walking away from that, I just find absolutely mind-boggling.
It's startling, and it all seems grounded in a particular strain of American thought that says, you just can't tell me what to do.
But that's evangelicism.
You're not the boss of me.
That is the historical roots of evangelicism, that we out here have a direct relationship with God. We know how to behave.
Bishops and papists and cardinals
are all back east. That's right.
Yeah, but I will, just as one funny data point about smallpox, which shows you how much our high standard of living has changed us. I was giving a lecture on a feel-good kind of holiday lecture on biological warfare, and one of my students came up to me and said, and I put up a picture of my vaccination card, that I've been vaccinated for smallpox. And he said, a kid came up to me after the lecture, he said, Professor, why did they vaccinate you for smallpox? Nobody gets that. And there was just this moment where I said, and it kind of happened. I want to finish, I've got a couple of questions, but I want to finish on an up note here. There's one question, and I want to ask you, how do you keep your optimism in these scary years?
So everybody always asks me that. And my answer is a really easy one, and I'm glad that we're ending on this note. I keep my optimism because I believe in American democracy. I believe in the idea of human self-determination and the idea that American democracy is a system of government most likely to achieve that. So I have faith in American democracy. But more than that, I have faith in the American people. I believe that the concept of human self-determination is the central project of humanity, and that the American people are stepping up to the plate right now to reclaim that. And there is a reason that this book is dedicated to my readers and to people like you. And I always like to take a moment to thank everybody for the dialogue that we have had going now for these 4 years as I've written back and forth with you, and you've asked questions and you've made comments and you've made criticisms, and you have helped me to learn so much about how our system works and so much about how decent Americans are and how fundamentally they care about American democracy. So the reason, first of all, that the book is dedicated to you is because of the support that you have given me all these years, for which I thank you from the bottom of my heart. I know I am the luckiest woman on earth to be able to keep the record of this country in these years, and I never forget that I can do it because of you all. So first of all, thank you for that. But second of all, I have faith because of you. And that never wavers, because you're there every night for me and for each other. And that's why I get up every morning and think, yet again tonight, I'm going to sit down at that laptop. So thank you. That's why I have faith. Thank Heather. I want to thank the JFK Library for bringing us together and for providing us with this arena, and to thank them for inviting me to talk with a friend, and to thank all of you for being here. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you very much. Thank you.